some point, you start to tell yourself that you have boundaries. You say that maybe you've learned how to protect your own energy, and that you don't tolerate certain behaviors anymore, and that you're choosing yourself over anyone else. And to an extent, maybe that is true. Or maybe it's just something else wearing the exact same clothes, the same mask, posing off as the same thing. Because there is a very, very fine line between self-respect and self-protection, and most people cross it without noticing at all. Self-respect is kind of grounded, it's quiet, and it doesn't flinch at all. You don't have to rehearse self-respect, and you don't feel the need to explain respecting yourself to anyone. You just know where you stand, you know your boundaries, and you act from that standpoint. If something crosses that line, then you respond naturally to it, and there is no bitterness, there's no tension or anything. There's no story that you have to justify yourself with afterwards. Self-protection, however, feels quite differently. Self-protection is sharper, it's a lot more defensive. It comes with justifications, it comes with scripts, it comes with explanations that you repeat in your head over and over and over so that the decision feels solid and you don't feel bad for making that decision. You tell yourself that you're being mature, but underneath that maturity is simply fear. It's fear of being exposed again, and it's fear of being hurt again, and it's fear of being seen where you're still fragile. Sometimes what we call boundaries aren't actually about dignity or anything like that. Instead, they're simply about avoidance. You cut people off because they're harmful to you, and you cut people off because they get too close to you, and you don't withdraw because something is wrong, but instead you withdraw because something to you matters. Self-protection simply wants distance. It wants control. It wants you to be safe from surprises because it feels that something is wrong. It builds walls that look like principles, and from the outside it is quite impossible, almost impossible to tell the difference. And because you look composed to other people, you look disciplined, and you look like someone who's learnt a lesson. But the issue is inside you, and only you know this, there is some sort of tension, because that protection is not peace. Instead, that protection is vigilance. And you can feel it in the way that you overthink your interactions with people, in how quickly you retreat the moment something feels uncertain to you. And it's how often you over and over tell yourself, I'm just not letting that in anymore. When in reality, the truth, the genuine raw truth, is that you're scared of what would happen if you did let that in. Self-respect does not need to announce itself. Self-protection does. It feels the necessity to expose itself to the world. There is an old idea in psychology and philosophy, it kind of resonates between the two, and it's that we don't just avoid pain. Instead, we avoid vulnerability. And it's not because vulnerability always hurts. Instead, it's because vulnerability removes control from your life. And control feels like a safety net. It feels like a shield when you've been burnt before. So you start designing a life that minimizes risk and minimizes that vulnerability and exposing yourself to risks. There's fewer attachments, there's fewer expectations, and there's fewer situations where you'd have to actually show up fully. You call that growth. In your mind, you call it, self-improvement. You call it growth from the person you once were. But slowly and quietly and without you noticing at all, your life starts to shrink and it starts to get smaller and smaller, and the circles get smaller and your social interactions get less and less. And now, instead of being mistreated, you're just simply not being interacted with at all. And where it gets uncomfortable in that sense is that some of the things that you label as self-respect are actually just fears that never got resolved. They're just reorganized. They're just put back into a different position, labeled as something else. Real, genuine self-respect does not isolate you from every single scenario. Instead, it steadies you within those scenarios. It doesn't say things like, I won't ever be hurt again. Instead, it says things like, if I am who I am, I will survive it. And that difference is what matters so much between protecting yourself and actually respecting yourself. Because like I said, self-protection keeps you safe at the cost of aliveness, at the cost of living. You don't get blindsided, but you also don't get surprised by anything. You don't get betrayed, but you also don't get deeply known. You don't have any interactions or any relationships. And you don't lose control, but you don't feel much of it either. And the worst part about that is that it works. For most people, as a matter of fact, it works for them. You feel calmer and you feel less volatile and less exposed and less random in life. However, the issue with that is that you mistake that numbness and that numb stability for some sort of peace. However, peace will never ever require any sort of armor. Peace will never have to flinch when things get close. Self-respect allows you to engage with things without disappearing. It lets you say no to people without building a fortress around the world, and it lets you stay open without being naive to anything. Self-respect trusts your ability to respond, not your ability to hide. That is the key difference between the two. As a matter of fact, most people don't struggle with a lack of boundaries. They struggle with boundaries that are doing the wrong job for them. They're trying to protect wounds that were never processed, so the boundaries have to work overtime. And you can feel that when that boundary comes with anger or resentment or a rehearsed explanation that you've practiced in your head over and over to tell that person. When you need to convince yourself that you're right every single time you enforce those boundaries, something else is going on. There's something wrong within it. Self-respect is boring, but it's boring in the best way possible. It doesn't spike your nervous system, it doesn't mess with your brain, and it doesn't need to prove anything to anyone else. Self-protection is loud internally. It messes with your body. It's always scanning. It's always ready. It's always braced. If you're honest, you will genuinely know which one you're living from, simply from the explanation I've given in this video. You can feel that in your body. You can feel it in your mind right now that I've started to question it. One of them feels grounded. One of them feels genuine. It feels like the actual way you should be living. And the other one feels tight and it feels unnatural. And this video isn't some sort of call for you to drop your guard recklessly. It's not about letting every single person you talk to into your life and telling them everything. Instead, it's just about noticing whether you're choosing distance because it aligns with who you are now as a person, or because you're just reacting as someone you used to be. You're reacting to the way that you used to react to things. You're reacting in the exact same way because you were hurt in the past. Because to be honest with you, the goal is not to never get hurt again. That is simply impossible. And if you try and do that through self-respect or self-protection, neither of them will work. The goal is to be someone who doesn't have to disappear to feel safe. Someone who doesn't have to block absolutely everything out just to avoid one thing slipping in. And the moment that you can tell that difference and you can feel the difference between that self-respect and that self-protection, your life will start to quietly expand and you'll start to feel like you're genuinely living once again.